Welcome to the deep dive. This time, we're diving into a true crime story. This one was sent to us by Shelley Dennis. She reached out to us hoping to shed light on her mother's death. Her mother, Rosemary Dennis, she had kind of a tough upbringing. She grew up as one of 20 children. She spent a lot of time in orphanages and foster homes, bouncing around between the two. So you can kind of understand why she yearned for like a normal life. And it seemed like on the surface, that's what she built. With her husband, Marvin, quiet life in the suburbs of New York, camping trips, family hikes. But then on May 3rd, 1992, everything changed.
Yeah, it sounds like one of those stories ripped right from the headlines. So Rosemary is found dead at the bottom of a cliff after a hike with Marvin. He claims it was a tragic accident, but right from the beginning, his behavior is a little strange.
Yeah, Shelley finds him at the police station. And like before she could even process anything, think about what's going on. His first words are, "She fell. I swear she fell." Like he's already on the defensive before anyone has even accused him of anything.
That's a really interesting detail. I mean, think about it. Most people in that situation would be overwhelmed, with grief, shock, confusion. But his immediate reaction is to defend himself before anyone has said anything. It makes you think. Like, is he hyper aware of suspicion already? Did he rehearse his alibi or
I
something?
think it's even more bizarre.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he insists that Shelley throw away her mother's clothes. He calls them evil. And then there's this whole whistling incident. Like one minute he's crying inconsolably, and the next he's casually whistling while taking out the trash.
So that's not just odd. I mean, it speaks to a possible disconnect between his outward display of grief and his actual internal emotional state. It's like he's performing grief for an audience, but he lacks genuine empathy, this kind of flip-flopping emotionally. Especially in the immediate aftermath of a tragedy, it's a big red flag for investigators because it suggests the possibility of a carefully constructed facade.
While Shelley is grappling with her grief, she starts to notice more cracks in this, perfect family image. She says that her father was very controlling, verbally abusive, particularly towards her brother. Makes you wonder, if this is how he treated his own children, what was happening behind closed doors with Rosemary?
Yeah, absolutely. Abuse within a family, it rarely exists in a vacuum. If he felt comfortable behaving that way with his children, it's very likely that Rosemary was subjected to similar or even worse treatment.
And then there's a bombshell revelation. Shelley kept this secret for years. Her father had an affair with a woman named Rodelle. He even asked Shelley to help him buy Rodelle lingerie.
Wow. So that's not just a cringeworthy detail. It gives us a glimpse into this manipulation that was going on. He's not just having an affair. He's involving his own daughter in his deception,
Right.
Blurring the lines of what's appropriate, potentially even using her as an unwitting accomplice.
And the plot thickens even more when you consider this, even with the affair and his strange behavior. There's no concrete evidence linking Marvin to Rosemary's death. The medical examiner ruled it an accidental drowning.
This is what makes concealed crime so interesting. Maybe he chose a method that would look like an accident, so it would be really hard to prove foul play. Drowning, especially somewhere like a cliffside, can be easily staged. It raises an interesting question. How do you prove intent when the cause of death could be interpreted as accidental?
It's such a frustrating situation for Shelley. Her marriage falls apart under the weight of her grief and her suspicions. And Marvin starts acting increasingly paranoid, convinced his phone is tapped. It almost feels like he's projecting his own guilt onto the world around him.
That's not uncommon in cases like this, when someone commits a crime. Especially when they think they've gotten away with it. They often experience this heightened anxiety. They become hypervigilant, seeing threats everywhere, even if they aren't real. This paranoia, as irrational as it may seem, can be a manifestation of their subconscious guilt. Years go by, and Shelley's caught in this agonizing limbo, desperately seeking justice, but just hitting a wall. Facing resistance from the local district attorney. This isn't just about one woman's struggle. It highlights a systemic issue. Cases that rely on circumstantial evidence often get pushed aside. Makes you wonder how many people are getting away with things because the burden of proof is just too high.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. But then a new district attorney takes office, and he brings a fresh perspective to cold cases. And this is where things get interesting. Remember those witnesses who saw Marvin at the falls?
Yes, their testimony was initially dismissed because they had criminal records. They said they saw Marvin holding Rosemary underwater, but their past made them easy to discredit. It's a perfect example of how bias in the legal system can actually obstruct justice. Just because someone has a criminal record doesn't make them a liar.
Right. And the new DA recognized this. He understood that these witnesses, despite their past, They were in the right place at the right time, and their account, even though it was initially overlooked, it lined up perfectly with the medical examiner's findings.
He wasn't just reviewing the case, he was actively challenging the assumptions that had been made previously. He was willing to look beyond the surface and consider the context of the witness's statements. That kind of critical thinking, it can make such a difference.
Yeah, totally. So with this new evidence, the DA finally decides to press charges against Marvin. 7 years after Rosemary's death, he's arrested and charged with second-degree murder. It's a huge victory for Shelley, but it also kind of puts her in this moral and emotional battleground.
She's facing this terrible dilemma to get justice for her mother. She has to testify against her own father. It's such a betrayal, but it's also an act of incredible courage.
It's amazing. Shelley goes above and beyond. She even agrees to wear a wire to try and get information from her father's new wife. It's such a risky move, but it just shows her commitment to finding out the truth.
This is where the case becomes almost Shakespearean. The daughter becomes the one who might bring down her own father. Imagine that weight, the emotional toll it must have taken on her.
The trial becomes this battle of narratives. The defense tries to discredit Shelley. They try to paint her as an unreliable witness, driven by grief and resentment. They say that she initially defended her father and only changed her story after all the unsettling incidents at home.
That's a classic tactic, trying to create doubt. Using the complexities of family relationships against her, saying her emotions are clouding her judgment so she can't be trusted.
But the prosecution, they present a different story. They emphasize Shelley's willingness to come forward, even though it meant betraying her father. They highlight how her testimony lines up with the eyewitness accounts and Marvin's strange behavior. It starts to paint a picture of a calculated murder.
They basically create a timeline, and it shows a motive. Marvin wanted to be with Rodell, so he got rid of his wife. To start a new life, it becomes a story of ambition and betrayal.
After weeks of battling it out in court, the jury finally delivers its verdict. Marvin Dennis is found guilty of second-degree murder. Justice prevails. But for Shelley, it's a bittersweet victory. The man who murdered her mother is still her father.
The trial may be over, but for Shelley, the emotional part of this continues. She's left dealing with this profound sense of loss and all these conflicting emotions, love and anger towards the same person.
But Shelley handles all of this so gracefully. Despite everything that's happened, she still loves her father. She even writes a letter to the judge asking for leniency in his sentencing.
That's incredible. It shows how much empathy she has. She recognizes her father did something awful. But she also sees his good qualities. It really shows the complicated nature of forgiveness, especially within a family.
Marvin is sentenced to the maximum, 25 years to life. But Shelley's journey isn't over. She has to rebuild her life, carrying the weight of her mother's death and her father's betrayal.
Her story becomes more than just the pursuit of justice. It becomes a story of resilience. She chooses to focus on her children, creating a new life for herself, one that honors her mother's memory. It's really inspiring to see how she doesn't let tragedy define her. Instead, she chooses to move forward with strength and purpose.
It's incredible how Shelley is able to build this life filled with joy. She even fulfills a childhood dream, buying a 110-year-old house with an outdoor pool.
Yeah, it's like the symbol of renewal, like she's taking back the happiness that was stolen from her. But there's something we haven't really talked about, the impact Rosemary had. We talked earlier about how Rosemary craved love and attention, maybe because of her tough childhood.
Right. And knowing Marvin was so controlling and abusive, it makes you wonder if he used that to his advantage.
Absolutely. Abuse is about power and control. Maybe Marvin saw Rosemary's need for affection and used it to manipulate her, to make her depend on him. It's a scary thought, but it could explain why she stayed in a relationship that was clearly not good for her.
It's a reminder that abuse can be hidden. It can look like love or concern. And it's so important to see those warning signs, not just for ourselves, but for others who might be trapped.
Yeah, for sure. Early intervention is so important. When we understand the patterns of abuse, we can help ourselves and others break free.
So what about Shelley's brother? He's not as much a part of the story, but he also had a hard childhood, and yet he managed to build a successful life. Does that mean resilience is something you can learn? Or are some people just better at handling trauma?
That's a great question. Some people might be naturally more resilient, but it's definitely a skill you can develop. Both Shelley and her brother went through so much trauma, but they both made the choice to move on, to break free from the past. They found support, healthy ways to cope, and they chose to define themselves by their actions, not by what their parents did.
It's a message of hope. Even when things seem impossible, you can heal, you can grow, you can create a meaningful life. What are some of the most important takeaways from this deep dive?
I think this story shows how important it is to look deeper. We didn't just talk about the crime, we talked about the relationships, the motivations, the flaws in the system. It reminds us that the truth can be hard to find, it can be hidden by lies and biases.
It also shows the incredible strength people have. Shelley's fight for justice, her ability to forgive, and her commitment to building a better future. It's inspiring.
And I think it's a reminder that abuse comes in many forms. We need to learn about the signs of manipulation and control to protect ourselves and the people we care about.
This deep dive has been so insightful. It's a story about love, loss, betrayal, and the power of the human spirit. If you were Shelley, how would you have handled all of this? What does this story tell us about grief, forgiveness, and hope? We'll leave you with that.